We're now going to talk with Louise Knight, who is author of this new book on Jane Addams. In fact, this book has not even published yet. It's publishing in September. Louise Knight, what was Hull House?
Hull House was a settlement house, and a settlement house was the first kind of community-based center that we know in the Western world. Before that, churches were the centers of community, but in the 1890s, there was a need to secularize community-based services and neighborhood feeling, and also a place to provide culture, education, clubs, lectures. So a settlement house was a very vital, lively place.
Was Hull House unique? Was Jane Addams unique in developing Hull House?
Well, she was one of the first to have a settlement house in the United States. Two of them were opened simultaneously, one in New York and one in Chicago, which was Jane Addams's settlement house. But the first was in London, and it was called Toynbee Hall, and it was opened in 1886. So Hull House opened 3 years after that.
Where did the settlement house philosophy come from?
Well, it came from the mind of the founder of Toynbee Hall. He himself was an Anglican minister, and he was very frustrated because he couldn't get the working class people in his neighborhood on the East End of London to come to church. And meanwhile, he had alumni of Oxford coming to visit him, and they were interested in learning more about the working classes. So he said, let's find a place where the graduates of Oxford and Cambridge can live, work in the city, and mingle socially, because this will perhaps reach the working class neighbors more than Christianity will.
How did Jane Addams develop her politics?
Well, her politics evolved, first of all, which is not something that's understood because most people read her published books, and her first book came out when she was older than 40. So in her 30s, when she first started living at Hull House, she was making a shift from a sort of highly idealistic attitude towards what makes society work, which was that capitalism could be trusted, to a much more insightful, realistic understanding that limits had to be placed on capitalism, especially through the action of unions, which she came to understand was necessary.
In this book, you write that she evolved herself as she evolved her politics. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the things she had to work through, she had a couple of issues she had to work through in order to, first of all, found Hull House, and second of all, to evolve her politics. The first issue was, could a woman found an institution and, in effect, decide not to be married, decide not to conform with her family's expectations as an upper middle class woman, which is to devote herself to family, whether her own or her siblings. So she overcame that, partly by reading John Stewart's Subjection of Women, very important book for her. And then when she got to Hull House, she had some more baggage she had to outgrow. And one of those things was thinking that capitalists could be trusted to do the right thing for their workers. And another was a deep belief in moral absolutism, which she had inherited from her father. And that was the most radical change she made, because she finally decided that maybe what was right and wrong evolved with the times, and that you had to stay with the times and adjust your beliefs to keep up with the times. That's pretty radical.
You write that she was raised basically with noblesse oblige.
Yes, she was. Her father was quite a wealthy man in a small town. Not wealthy according to New York City standards, but prosperous and very comfortable with many businesses. He was a banker. And so she definitely knew what it felt like to be the most privileged family in a small town. And then she traveled in Europe in her 20s, so that's a very rare opportunity in the 1880s. And then she had a college degree, and as a woman, that was extremely rare. 0.02% of college women between 18 and 22, college-age women, had actually earned a college degree in those years. So she definitely felt very special. And that was the issue for her when she came to Hull House was, all right, I have an education, I must know a little bit more than the folks around me who are working class immigrants. And what she came to realize, which was quite a shock to her, but very appropriate lesson, is that in fact the immigrant working class people around her knew a great deal more about life than she did. and were, compared to her own class, far more generous, far more giving. And she was very impressed.
And who were her parents, especially her father?
Her father was John Addams, two Ds, not to be confused with the president. And her mother was Sarah Addams. They're both from Pennsylvania. They came out in the 1840s to Illinois as young newlyweds, as pioneers, really, to settle in a very tiny town called Cedarville, and is just 6 miles south of the Wisconsin border. And so they were idealistic. They were Christians. They were activist Christians. They had deep beliefs in the need to contribute to your world in a good way.
And but you start off the book with the death of her mother.
Yes. Yes, it was obviously it's a tremendous tragedy for any child. Addams was just a little 2.5. And it's hard to know what exactly that means for a child because a young child can't express it. But you can see in Addams' writings that death was not something she could shake. It was something that continued to arise in her comments about what she saw. She had a real sort of, not terror of death exactly, but a psychic scar from the experience of death that seemed to have contributed to some of her motivations for helping the poor, because they lived closer to death than she did.
This is your second book on Jane Addams.
Yes.
And in fact, here's the first one. We want to show both of these here. Why your fascination with her?
Well, in the first case of the first book, I was really trying to figure out how she made all these transitions from being a member of an elite class, highly educated, and not necessarily prepared to go live among the working poor. And so I wanted to see how did she make that transition, and then how did she change once she put herself in an entirely new situation. The second book is the whole life, and that's because there hasn't been a whole life of her in 37 years, which is a long time. And during those years, a lot of people have been working on the issues and the history that she was involved in, and she also needed to have her story told from the point of view of respecting her as a political activist and not just as a philanthropist who started a settlement house, because even though that was a great accomplishment, she did much more than that.
Who were some of the famous visitors to Hull House? When did she win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, the visitors to Hull House that are often cited include people like H.G. Wells and the author Sinclair Lewis. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was there for about 6 months.
Who was she?
She was a feminist theorist, a poet, a novelist, and an activist for feminism to a lesser degree, but quite a thinker. And there were a lot of famous labor leaders, like Robert Burns came over, or no, I didn't get that name right. Mr. Burns, who was a labor leader, came over from London. And then lots of people from the United States visited. Theodore Roosevelt visited, Eleanor Roosevelt visited much later. So famous people were always passing through. But I don't think she would have thought much of the emphasis on the famous people who came to Hull House, because that wasn't really what it was about. It was for all of Chicago, every walk of life.
When did she win the Nobel Peace Prize?
In 1931.
For what?
Well, it was in some ways for everything, but more specifically, she was a leader of the founding of the women's peace movement, both in this country and in Europe during the war, during World War I.
She was a pacifist.
She was more than a pacifist. A pacifist will be opposed to particular wars. She was opposed to nonviolence in general. And so she was always trying to talk about what were better ways to resolve the issues that war was being used to resolve. And women during World War I were the ones who were willing to think about that. And there was huge pressure in this country not to during that time.
Was she considered a radical in her time?
It depended on the times. In the 1912 period, which was a fairly progressive period, she was not considered a radical. During World War I and the conservative 20s, she was.